Hello, and welcome to the first of a short series of videos I put together called Learning Chinese Starting from Zero. I made these videos to give anyone interested in starting to learn Chinese an easy and hopefully comfortable place to start. So if you know absolutely nothing, or very little at all, about Chinese, but are interested in maybe starting to learn this fascinating language, I hope this series of videos can help you out. Now, I am not Chinese, so you might be thinking, why is this non-Chinese guy trying to teach me Chinese? Well, from my experience, I found that when you're just starting to learn a language, it's often best to get the very basics from someone who's gone through exactly the same early struggles that you're going to go through. And that's something that a native speaker really hasn't had to do. For example, when I first started to learn Chinese, I can confess I spun my wheels for quite a while. It was all so different, didn't make a lot of sense. I was having a lot of problems. And I had good teachers, but they didn't really seem to understand where my problems were coming from. So my hope is that with these few videos, I can help you survive your first few weeks or months in a classroom with a teacher who is a native speaker, because I still think that's a really good way to go. And overall, I hope these videos, make you take that first step and maybe sign up for a course or maybe on your own start to learn Chinese. Now, the first question I usually get from people is, isn't Chinese the hardest language ever to learn? I can never learn it. And, well, first of all, it's demonstrably not true because 1.3 billion Chinese know how to speak Chinese, so it cannot be impossible to learn. And in fact, recently, one of my favorite polyglots, Benny from Ireland, he was in Taiwan. He went there for about 3 months in early 2012, and in 3 months, he was able to get to a pretty reasonable level of fluency, at least when it came to conversation. So, we're not all polyglots, but I think it is possible to get to a reasonable level without, an incredible amount of problems. So, obviously the next question is, is Chinese hard to learn? And I'd have to say yes and no. What makes Chinese difficult is that there are very few words like English. So if you've ever studied some French or some Spanish before, you'll notice that a lot of the words in French and Spanish, have roots that are similar to English, or a lot of the words almost sound the same. In Chinese, you have absolutely zero of that. Every word you learn, pretty much, you're going to have to learn from scratch. So there's no free vocabulary. The other difficult part, of course, is that reading Chinese is difficult. It's hard. It takes a lot of work, it takes a lot of memorization, and it takes a lot of time. Speaking, on the other hand, is a lot easier. And the basic reason is that, again, if you've studied Spanish or French and you've had to conjugate verbs and learn all the tenses and subjunctives and all this kind of thing, in Chinese you don't have any of that. And I'll explain why later, but one of the beauties is the grammar is dead simple at the beginning. So it's easier to get to a where you can feel comfortable talking quite easily because you're not worried about the grammar all the time. Now, start with the big difference. The big difference between Chinese and English, of course, is that English and Western languages are based on alphabets, and Chinese is based on pictures. So if we see here, we've got a series of English words, and we know how to say them because we know how to say the letters in the alphabet, and we can pronounce them. And even if we've never seen the word before, we can kind of guess what that sound of that word is. We can also, as I've done in this column here, put them in alphabetical order. If we look over here, we've got the Chinese characters that have the same meaning as the English words. And you'll see that sometimes it's just one character, like for moon, or for telephone, it's 2 characters, and sometimes it's 3 characters. That convey the same concept as an English word. So it's not necessarily that one character means one word. Okay? So it can be a number of characters together that make up a word. Now, if you think about it for a second, one of the interesting questions you might have is, how do you put those in alphabetical order? How would I find those in a dictionary? Now, believe it or not, there are Chinese dictionaries, and it is possible to look up these words in a Chinese dictionary, but it's very different from the way we do in English and takes a lot more time. On the plus side these days, the beauty of technology is it's a lot easier. You don't have to use a paper dictionary anymore. So it's actually an awful lot simpler than it was years ago to learn the pronunciation of Chinese characters. Now, every character comes with a sound. So this has a sound. Each character has its own sound. The question you might be asking is, well, how do you know which sound it is? I mean, in English, we just look at the alphabet or the way it's written, and we can pretty much pronounce it. Well, the bad news is in Chinese, you can't do that. For beginning learners, there's no way you're going to know. You just have to learn every single one. And yes, it takes time, but unfortunately, there are no shortcuts when it comes to that. One of the things they've done to make it a little bit easier, though, is they've come up with a way of romanizing or putting into an alphabet the sounds that occur in Chinese. So each of these is kind of not in English, it's a romanization of it. So you might be fooled, though, because you see a word like that and you go, oh, that's ri. And you go, no, in Chinese it's not ri, it's ri. So what you learn very quickly is that although you think you know how to say these words, you don't. You have to learn the specific ways that they're learned in Chinese. For example, this is shi, it's not shi. So you have to learn them, but the good news is they are quite easy to learn. I'll talk about that in a minute. And once you know those, you're set. Now, before we get a little bit more into the sounds of Chinese, there's two questions that come up a lot when I'm talking to people. And the first one is, what's the difference between Mandarin, Cantonese, Shanghainese, Taiwanese, all these other kinds of Chinese that we hear about? And the second question is, what's the difference between simple and traditional characters? So in Chinese, the writing between all the dialects is pretty much the same. So if I have a piece of paper and it's written in Chinese, I can give it to someone who speaks only Cantonese and someone who speaks only Mandarin, and both of them will be able to read it and understand it. But if I read it in Cantonese, only the Cantonese person will be able to understand it. If I read it in Mandarin, only the Mandarin person will be able to understand it. And the difference between Cantonese and Mandarin is when you hear them is much bigger than, say, the difference between Spanish and Italian. It's light years apart in terms of sound. So the difference basically is that each character is pronounced using different sounds. So Mandarin has its own set of sounds and Cantonese has its own set of sounds, but they apply them to the same characters. Now, when we talk about characters, there's two ways of writing in Chinese. One is what's called traditional Chinese and one's called simplified. In traditional, it tends to be a more complex character, and this is traditionally what it's been. But in China, after the revolution in 1949, the government wanted to simplify it and try and improve the literacy rate. So what they did is they simplified the characters, made them easier to write, easier, hopefully, to understand. So you'll find traditional characters still used in Taiwan and some overseas communities, and you'll see simplified characters you learn in mainland. So it depends where you're going to learn Chinese and where you're going to use Chinese as to which one you want to learn. A lot of the differences in simplification are pretty standard, so once it doesn't really take that long to adjust from one to the other. So you can learn one and pick up the other one without too much effort. Now let's get back to sounds. This is the interesting stuff. So in Mandarin, there are basically, by my count, 404 sounds. That's it. Okay? So you say, so what? 404 sounds. Okay. You need basically 3,000 characters if you want to learn. If you want to read a newspaper, you need to know how to read 3,000 characters. And the average literate person knows about 5,000 characters. Okay, so if you're doing some basic math in your head, you're realizing that, wait a minute, basically there are 10 characters for every sound. And you go, that could be confusing. And yes, it potentially is. So I want to give you an example, a little bit how we have something very similar in English, but to a very, very small degree. But I want to give you a little bit of a sample for it. So what I want you to do is I want you to listen really carefully to what I'm going to say. You may or may not be able to understand it. You'll get some of it. But I want you to listen carefully. I'm going to say it twice. So, can you see and hear the whole sea from the hole in the can over here? One more time. Can you see and hear the whole sea from the hole in the can over here? Now, if you understood it, great. If you didn't, give you a bit of a look at what we talked about. So what you see is that we've used 4 sets of 2 words that sound the same but have different meanings. Now you got to think Chinese is essentially that taken to the extreme. Every sentence, every paragraph, everything you hear in Chinese basically has about roughly 400 sounds, possibly. So it's quite possible that in the same sentence, you're going to hear the same sound 3 times, and it could have 3 different meanings. And if you're thinking, how in the world am I ever going to do that? Well, you just, if you understood what I'd said before, your brain is basically wired to be able to handle that. It just takes practice. Okay, and we'll get a little bit into ways to make that easier, but it definitely is possible. So, like I said, what do? We need 5,000 characters, and we only have 400 sounds. There's got to be something we can do to make this a little bit more understandable. Luckily, there is. So in Chinese, what they've done, in Mandarin, they've added tones, or in all the Chinese dialects, they have tones. In Mandarin, there are 4 tones. I think in Cantonese, there's 8. So count yourself lucky. In Mandarin, it's only 4. And what that does is, so each sound, each character has a sound and a tone. So what that does is it adds another dimension. It helps understanding. And I'm going to give you an example how. So if we take, this is a standard example in Chinese, if we take the sound ma, which is one of the roughly 400 sounds, if we say it in the first tone, and I'm not really going to get into tones that much because that's for a native speaker to teach you, not me, but just to give you a quick example. So if I say ma, it's mother. If I say ma, it's hemp. If I say ma, it's horse. And if I say ma, it's to scold. Now, what's the benefit of that? The benefit is that we take 400 sounds, and now we have 1,600 possible sounds. So 4 tones for each sound. Now the problem is, so that's good, but the problem is we still have, for the average literate person, 5,000 characters, so there still is overlap, roughly 3 to 1. So tones help, but we still need some more help. Now, this is probably the single most important thing I want you to take out of this video. When you're speaking Chinese, and if you ever start to learn Chinese, the single most important thing you need to remember at the beginning is context. So the more information you can provide to the listener who's listening to you talk, the better the chance is that they're going to understand you. And I'll give you an example. So if in English I say to you, what does can mean? Well, it's kind of ambiguous because it could be a tin can, or it can be, what can I do? Or if I say, what does 8 mean? Well, it could mean I ate dinner, or I ate dinner at 8 o'clock. So it's 2 8s. So you wouldn't ask the question like that. You might give it in a sentence, for example. And from that, the listener will be able to understand what you mean. So this is kind of rule 1, or suggestion number 1. In Chinese, you always want to give as much context as possible to help the listener understand you. You never want to just say, what does this mean? Because chances are they won't have a clue. So context is everything. So to review this video, let's go through the basic concepts. So first of all, Chinese is a language that has characters, not an alphabet. And that has implications for how we learn the characters and how difficult it is to learn the characters. But it also has implications for grammar. And that's what I want to talk about in the next video. And I think you'll find it really quite interesting because it really helps keep the grammar simpler than in other languages. But the problem is there's a limited number of sounds in Chinese. And that can make understanding a little bit confusing, especially at the beginning, because you keep hearing the same sound, but it's having different meanings. Chinese uses tones to give the language some more unique sounds. And so you got to do a little bit of work at the beginning on tones so you can start to hear the differences. Okay. So that's basically what I want to talk about in the first video, just to give you a rough introduction of Chinese. In the second video, like I said, I'm going to get more into some of the structure of the language. And I think you'll find it quite interesting. So if you would like to, just click on to the next video, and we'll see you there.